On today's World Insight, Chinese Premier Li heads to Paris after wrapping up his trip to Berlin, where he met German Chancellor Scholz. What does Premier Li's first trip abroad mean for China-EU ties?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. Chinese Premier Li Qiang began his official visit to Germany on June the 18th. This is Premier Li's first overseas visit since he took office in March. Coincidentally, this trip took place the same day U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken came to Beijing and met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Where will China-EU relations go, and what does the official visit by the Chinese premier mean for the relations between China and Germany and China and France? Before we loop in our panelists, take a look at this first.
It was all about business as Chinese and German officials met in Berlin on Tuesday. That's understandable. $320 billion in trade was done between the two countries last year, and China is on course to be Germany's largest trading partner for an 8th consecutive year.
As two influential countries in the world, China and Germany should work more closely together to make more contributions to world peace and development. China attaches great importance to the development of China-Germany relations and China-EU relations. We are willing to work together with Germany to promote the continuous development of China-Germany and China-EU relations to achieve a higher level of development on a new starting point.
Li also had a message for German CEOs, to whom he said the biggest risk is a lack of cooperation. Scholz has faced questions over a potential decoupling of Germany from China. The German Chancellor dismissed that outright.
I've said it often, and I have also emphasized it today to my colleague Li. We have no interest in an economic decoupling from China.
Li described economic conditions in Germany and China as mutually beneficial.
Indeed, China has a huge market, a complete industrial system, abundant human resources, and a solid economic foundation. The long-term positive fundamentals of our economy have not changed, and we have the ability and confidence to promote sustainable and healthy economic development. Germany has a high level of economic development and strong scientific and technological strength. Strengthening economic and trade exchanges and technical cooperation between China and Germany, enhancing economic vitality and resilience, will contribute to the world economy.
Climate change and green technologies are areas where Berlin and Beijing can cooperate. Both the Chancellor and the Premier acknowledged the threats posed to the environment and the potential changes technology could bring.
In Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University. In Paris, Joab Tolker, Professor at American Graduate School in Paris. In Beijing, Liu Mingli, a research fellow from the Institute of European Studies with China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, so far, the Chinese Premier's visit to Europe has been bringing a lot of press coverage. Among all of those, Professor Bruckner, what are you looking at the most?
Well, first of all, it's a very positive sign that we have face-to-face communication that wasn't possible during the pandemic, and then everything was postponed, and we have a relatively new German government that also needs to calibrate its relations in different directions. And the elephant in the room is the war in Ukraine, in which everyone believes we should do more to settle it. And that's why it was very important to have conversations between Olaf Scholz and his counterpart from China to discuss ways how we can improve the situation there and stop the killing.
Right. Of course, the two sides have already met. Professor Liu, to you, I guess the other elephant in the room is really the China-U.S. relations. We see this visit taking place almost in parallel with U.S. senior officials' visit to China. How do you see, on both sides, things are going? How are they likely to interact and impact one another?
I think it's very interesting to talk about the triangle relations between China, United States, and Europe. Yes, I think the world is affected by China-US tensions, including the China-Europe relations. We have noticed that the transatlantic relations had shifted towards maybe just a few years ago, the European leaders had been promoting the thinking strategic independence. But for the time being, it seems that after the breakout of the Ukraine crisis, Europe relied more and more on U.S. on security issues. I think that's one of the reasons why Europe's attitude towards China has changed. For this basis, we noticed European Union has launched a paper on economic security, and for Germany, who also launched the first paper of national security, and China was mentioned 6 times in it. I think it is to some extent is both affected by the relations between China and the United States. And for this reason, it is a good time for the two sides, China and Germany, and China and Europe, to talk about what kind of relation should be.
Professor Bruckner, come back to you again before we go to our French counterpart. One is about the visit earlier taken by the German Prime Minister, Chancellor, to China right after he came into the office at the end of last year. That has, in a way, showcased to Europe continent about the pioneering spirit of this chancellor. Certainly, he had good and close discussions with the Chinese leaders then. Meanwhile, we also see this time the new Chinese Prime Minister, Premier, talking about decoupling is not the option. Talking about lack of cooperation is really the risk. He also suggests the interdependence is not a reason for risk, but rather a reason for future peace. So how do you look at both the earlier visit by the German Chancellor to China last year, and this time shall I say, the polite revisit by the Chinese Premier to Germany as the first international stop for his premiership?
Well, it certainly underlines a different self-perception of the new German government, that it shows more appetite for leadership, which previous governments were rather reluctant. And that was not just the government, it was also public opinion believes that Germany is not powerful enough to take a lead in the European Union, even if everyone looks at us as the country that is bigger than others. But after all, it's not more than 25% if you look at different indicators. So this is now slowly changing. But I think it's also addressing the naivete that was part of our focus on internal affairs of the European Union and taking everything for granted. Cheap energy from Russia, cheap security from the United States, and cheap products from China, which is something that worked well in the past, but who knows if it works in the future. So it's certainly not about decoupling, but it's definitely about de-risking.
Mr. Liu, coming back to you again, de-risking, decoupling. Earlier, there were some Chinese analysts suggesting we hope that all these change of words will not just be a game of words, but rather meaning the same thing. How do you see, the terminologies changing, but actually the essence of the relationship as a result of this good round of communication by the visit by Chinese new premier to Germany?
Yes, I think the word decoupling, I think mostly came from the United States, which is giving up in Europe now. De-risking seems to be popular, but the question is how to define de-risking. What it really means. From Li Qiang's visit, we can see that this visit, Premier, this first visit is welcomed in Germany during the conference between Li Qiang and the business leaders. I can see that there are a lot of economic opportunity between the two sides. I think the business is the decision maker, because if the Germany is a market economy, I think the government cannot make the decision for the business, for the enterprises. For these enterprises, some of them invest a lot in China and earn prospect, and some of them are working with Chinese counterparts in Germany. I think from the business, I think there is no de-risk.
So, Professor Toker, of course, Chinese Premier Li Qiang is going to visit France also and attend the new Global Financial Pact conference in Paris. How much expectation is there for both bilateral discussion and multilateral discussions about some of the urgency issues?
Well, the dialogue, which hopefully will develop over this Parisian summit over financial issues, will be one step. We should keep in perspective what has already happened on the record regarding Chinese-European agenda. We should keep in mind that there was some progress made around 2 years ago, which was blocked due to several issues, including the COVID, but also including some disagreements.
What kind of issues are you referring to?
I'm referring to the advanced treaty, which was discussed between China and...
You mean the investment treaty?
Which is still awaiting its ratification.
Yeah.
So it's on paper, and which has excellent ideas, but of course is not yet in action. So this is why I came back to the geostrategic issues in order to say that, yes, financial discussions will take place, and hopefully there would be some progress on them regarding, indeed, the international order when it comes to financial issues.
Okay.
But I think clarifications are still necessary in order to see through, including regarding financial issues, and those depend more on geostrategic issues than on purely financial ones.
This specific summit, new Global Financial Pact, is a crucial one because we are seeing the year 2023 is the deadline for a tremendous amount of global multilateral debts, the deadline of it. So we see some economies, especially developing economies, are going to be struggling a lot. So this has something to do with it. Meanwhile, we also see 3 years of pandemic, tremendous impact on all economies around the world. So what does that mean in terms of consultation done by Chinese premiers visit this time, together with other players that are under this pact?
I think for two reasons why this summit was held in Paris. I think first is that the financial situation has changed this year. We have noticed the financial turmoil in U.S. market and some risks in Europe, including Switzerland. I think it's the right time to talk about the financial stability at the global stage. And for the second reason is that why it's held in Paris. I think with the background of Brexit, Paris has been working hard to be the new financial hub in European continent. So a lot of financial infrastructure has been built recently. And the summit also served this purpose. And for China, I think when we take back to the 2008 financial crisis, China has played a very positive role. For this time, I think the international player will work with China.
But one thing is very interesting. A lot of people expect one visit to achieve a miracle. But we all know today in an ever-shifting world, things are changing very fast. So how to make sure this is going to be one of those, Mr. Liu, incremental steps of consultations between China and France, and also between China and China's European counterparts?
Yes, I think we need incremental steps to build trust. Trust is built slowly. It cannot happen overnight. During the past years, a lot of things happens. The geopolitical crisis in Europe, and the pandemic, and the shift of China policy. For the time being, there are some. We can see that some different views from the past. In the past, China was perceived more like a market which the Europeans can share. But recently, there are political views. Even some papers see China as a growing threat. So it's a very good moment for the China and Europe to talk about China's role in Europe and at the global stage.
We know that over the past few months, China and Germany has been working, both business communities, in fact, working quite closely, not only on making sure to brief the politicians on both sides on the directions that they hope they would see in terms of investment environment, in terms of cooperation, in terms of expanding the market, and etc. But also in terms of providing, some of the momentum for people-to-people and interactions between the two sides. So, Professor Buchner, tell me more about how do you see this layer of communication can contribute, and to what degree can contribute to the discussions at the political level?
Well, in the past, it was the most important part of German-Chinese relations and European in general. But Germany played a very particular role because a lot of the economic giants in Germany are so massively invested in China that it would ruin their business model if there would be something like decoupling or a major change. So everybody understands that it's important to keep these relations alive. But there are changes on a European Union level. For decades, the EU presented itself that austerity is important. We can't spend more than we earn, that we are politics of freer trade, like an open market, and therefore everyone can come. And that industrial policy is not exactly what the European Union stands for, but state aid and competition policy is a key element of how we run our economy. And all these three fields are now a subject of change, which will massively affect the business relations, not only of the giant companies like the chemical giant BASF or the big car manufacturers, but also the backbone of the German economy, the small and medium-sized enterprises. So this is currently discussed, and it changes the European Union into a global actor that is much more interest-based and not so much wishful thinking-based, that we believe that everything will be fine and our partners will treat us well and no one makes use of strategic dependencies. Dependencies exist on both sides and they are addressed in these bilateral communications, and that's why it's so important to have them.
About China and France, we saw earlier the important visit by French President to China. Certainly, it was quite an impressive one, even in the media coverage. And meanwhile, we also see that both sides are trying to work on some of the international issues, and France, diplomacy-wise, has always been maintaining a very important and independent image. So how do you see all these factors will come in to the discussion likely taking place between China and France this time during Chinese Premier's visit to Paris?
Yes, they will. They will be on the agenda, even if they will not be spelled out per se. Around the tables of the French-Chinese bilateral talks, or for that matter, the financial summit, which will take place in Paris. Yes, one more element we should pour into the overall perspective is, of course, the somehow original, at times extraordinary ambitions of President Macron and more generally French diplomacy, and in terms of playing an major international role. France is right now the only European member of the only EU member of the Security Council and the only nuclear power in amongst the EU members. We have just heard over the last few hours some more than rumors about President Macron's ambition to be invited to the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August. These were some remarks by French Foreign Minister Madame Colonna, who mentioned it. I guess if she mentioned it in public, it means that some contacts are taking place. This will be a precedent. If indeed France, or France as a representative of the EU, will be invited to the BRICS summit in Johannesburg in about 2 months, then we're seeing once again how both in geostrategic and trade, commerce, and financial issues, this new situation in the world, which requires clarification. I think that's the key word, perhaps.
Also about France, we see France has been one of the, very few European players that have been trying to talk to Russia, and also has been playing a proactive role over the past months about trying to look at the possibilities for peace. Of course, there are also harsh words coming from Paris toward Moscow about the conflict. But even on the geopolitical front, how do you see the Macron administration likely to seek space, more maneuvering in playing a more significant role on some of the issues, Professor?
Yes, indeed. President Macron has been, and still is very ambitious in terms of a potential role France may play when times would be perhaps slightly more favorable in terms for diplomacy rather than battlefield sound effects. Saw that a year and a half ago, before the war broke out, with Macron's rather unusual and risky trip of the last minute to Moscow. We saw afterwards harsh criticism against Macron, both at home in France and in other European and Western capitals. He is still accused of being, how should I say it, too close to Moscow in a way, although he explains that in rational and terms, saying that we should keep all doors open, even if no door is open right now, because the doors will open. Wars always finish, and they always, or almost always finish around the negotiation table. And Macron, actually ambitions very much to keep the potentiality of France's major role in contacts, post-war contacts, in this sense. This is how we should understand also some of the talks with China. In that sense, he is perhaps Macron, at least in terms of his ambitions. I don't know how many of those will come alive, more so than perhaps any other partner in the EU.
This is the first overseas trip taken by the new Premier Li Qiang after coming into the office in March earlier this year. And one of his most important tasks, of course, is to work on the economy. It's always been the task of any premier in history. So on the one hand, you see the Chinese economy in the long term has tremendous potential. In the short term, though, you saw the May number might not be necessarily that optimistic. How do you see this premier working on his official agenda, try to promote the trade and economic ties, try to convince whoever he's meeting that China is open, China is doing reform, and China wants to have more international investors and business to operate and to cooperate with China? Mr. Liu, is it convincing?
I think economic issues is still on the top agenda for Premier Li's visit to Germany and France. First of all, the relations between China and Europe, the major content is economic issues, because one is in Europe, the other in Asia. There are much less geopolitical cooperation or conflicts between each other. So the major content is economic cooperations. For example, China is Germany's #1 trading partner. So it's natural for the premier to visit Europe to seek more economic cooperations. But before that, I think to build more trust is an urgent job for this visit. because the situation has changed a lot during the past years. And for Premier Li, it's a new government, new premier, and the European leader want to know about this government and the policies of this government. So it is a good moment for the premier to work and communicate with European leaders to have trust. Then if we have the trust, then we can make more steps to seek further cooperations. And for economic issues, I think we have seen Premier Li's visit in Germany. I think it is welcomed by the business leaders. I personally will expect many more economic cooperations between China and the European member states, or Germany and France. For example, Germany is an advanced economy, but China has some advantage in terms of investment. For example, in the area of lithium battery and green technology. I think in these areas, China is catching up. There are cooperation areas. And for China, the investment from Germany is very important. Germany is a major source of FDI here in China. I think during this visit, China Premier will use this visit to show the European partners the current situation in China, and the investment from Europe is still welcome, and they have a huge opportunity for benefit.
As we know, at this point, the Chinese Commerce Minister and others are also meeting with the German counterpart on climate change issues and the sustainable development issues. So we see that both sides are also trying to work on the global challenges. How do you see these areas of work together could create more ambience and mutual trust between China and Germany?
Well, it is definitely a very good idea, not only in terms of communication, but also to look at the bigger picture and not isolate complicated issues or what works smoothly, like investment in the past. So it wins the hearts and minds of people in the German public to see that global problems can only be addressed globally, and we are all too small to find solutions for something that will define the way we live on this planet in the future. So this is important. We address it. It also makes positive headlines. And it's not just, are we seeing China shifting from a competitor and a purely economic giant to something that the United States will tell us is also a rival and a threat. So in this new calibration of defining what is possible and where we should work together, it's of utmost importance to address everything at once. And therefore, it was important to not just have bilateral communication of the two leaders, but a consultation of the cabinets.
Right. Well, there are a lot of things going on. I guess constant communications is certainly needed. Meanwhile, incremental steps, no expect of miracles at any certain moment would be a good idea. For now, I want to thank the three of you for helping us understand from your own perspective. Ulrich Bruckner, Joab Toker, Liu-Ming Li. Gentlemen, thank you so much. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, you can always find us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.